are going on in the Diocese of Atlanta. So Bishop became in the Diocese of Atlanta in 2012. Prior to that, he has served at St. John the Divine in New York City and also the historic St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Atlanta. There we go. Very nice. Also, he is an adjunct professor at Virginia Seminary and many, many other things on his resume. So we really are so grateful. I know you have a very busy schedule, and we're really grateful that this worked for you to be here. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, good morning to you.
Good morning.
I'm glad to be here. It's a little daunting. I sort of feel like, okay, let's talk about race. Go. Well, my gosh. But I do want to commend you, praise you, for having that conversation. I think, I hope it's obvious to you that as an American family, that conversation still needs some more work, still needs some more grace, still needs some more curiosity, less defensiveness, needs less condemnation and guilt, and more partnership. And so I feel like it's a very important conversation to be having. I feel like, I'm sort of just giving you the conceptual construct, I feel like if anything in our sacred book is right, that you and I, because of Jesus Christ, who is the center of our gathering, then you and I have a certain durability in our fellowship. You and I have, at least that's what the rapper says, that you and I have a certain elasticity in our fellowship, which allows us to be less brittle than other segments of the population as we have important conversations. And so that's sort of my construct. I could go lots of places, but I really want to hear more from you. I think what I also want to say is that I very often decline invitations to come and talk about race. I found that when I was a rector of a parish, and now as the bishop, I get lots of invitations to preach in mid-January. I get lots of, see if you can figure this one out, I get lots of invitations to preach in mid-February. That's Absalom Jones. That's the first black Episcopal priest, to say nothing of February. And I have made a point of declining those invitations by and large, because it all ends up being sort of a bit of a pretense, doesn't it? Which is, get the dude in here with a little bit of melanin, and let's sing the old songs of Zion, and then we're back to business as usual. So I find that I don't want to collude with that. However, I think that what continues to encourage me to have these kinds of conversations is if you and I will situate all the issues around neighbor, immigration, gun control, or public safety, however you want to frame it, and race, if you and I can situate that underneath the banner of love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and neighbor as self. So in other words, if you and I just want to have a conversation about melanin and the various aspects about that, well, wake me up when that's over, because that's a bore. But if you want to have a conversation about this dynamic notion of God and God's longing that you and I would treat one another as we actually are, which is neighbor, now you got my full attention. So that's that. A word or two about what I think we're doing in the Diocese of Atlanta. So, in the Diocese of Atlanta, that's where God lives in the wintertime, in case you don't know. Almost. So in Atlanta, you know, we have this problem. We have Martin and Coretta earthly remains sleeping there, within spitting distance of my office. And so we began to think about, what does the lawyer ask Jesus? The lawyer says, who is my neighbor? And then we use that sort of as a North Star to begin to think about having conversations and to begin to decide, what is our work? How do we stand on the shoulders of the work that has already been done? How do we add yet one more chapter to what I think is really important work? That's the work of beloved community, which Dr. King and others, many, many others, gave their life for. So that you and I, right now, I mean, I don't know. I know Dr. King has come here, but I don't know what the date was on the year of my birth, 1964, year of my conception, the summer of love. I don't know if you and I could have been family in this way. I don't know if you and I could have been family in this way. So we are the direct recipients of people's work, black and white alike, to bring a day where you and I could be here and acknowledge the fact that we are family under God. So we decided to change the name of our work in the Diocese of Atlanta from anti-racism to beloved community dismantling racism. Because we feel it's really important to be for something. I watch the news. Y'all watch the news? Yeah. No. One sister said no. You're probably smarter than I am, that's for sure. So because I'm the Bishop of Middle and North Georgia, I have to listen to Rush and Rachel. Now you're groaning, but someone on the other side is groaning as well. Because I think it's important to understand all the talking points. Right? So we're for beloved community, first and foremost. And so to try to figure that out, try to action all of that out. And so I hired a woman who is really the living, breathing embodiment of this good work. And her real offering is that she has been able to facilitate conversations, listen now, where we circumvent shame, guilt, and condemnation. I don't know if you get how important and add value that is. To begin to hold us together in a way where you and I don't default to those old sad narratives. We acknowledge our sinfulness. We acknowledge our collusion with the status quo. And at the same time, we have a conversation about our human commonality. So far, there's 109 dioceses in the Episcopal Church. So far, we've had about 70 of them in the Diocese of Atlanta to have this conversation. We've got the only curriculum written for 6th to 12th graders around being beloved community. We're getting the conversation into hands of young people earlier. And not only sort of one way, but also having them beta test that and then refine and tweak that for us so that we know that we have something that actually connects to the lives of young people. And so the center is the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Reconciliation and Healing. Just this last year, without even asking for money, we got a big grant from Trinity Wall Street and a big grant from the presiding bishop to do this work. And so far, I'm pleased to say that it's going very well. And it's going very well because people are having conversations. And that really is it. So much of what you and I think about race, it stays below the surface. Because we haven't found safe spaces to begin to confess our ignorance or our collusion or just our curiosity. And so again, we go back. The elasticity and the durability that we get with Christian fellowship is supposed to provide for that. And so, anybody here married? So I was talking to some friends last night and I was trying to liken, so what's the difficulty of really smart people just getting in a room and trying to work this out? Well, I'll tell you. If you're married, and of course all of you have wonderful, beautiful, wholesome, lovely examples of Christian love in your homes, of course. But for the rest of us sinners, oftentimes families are made up of sort of locked-in dance steps. When she says this, you do this. When he does this, you do this, and round we go. And the decades go by. Well, that's exactly what's happening in our American family around this issue. Right? Somebody gets killed, we have outrage, thoughts and prayers, on to the next one. Right? And so we do that all over again, right? So shall we support our police? Shall we support those people? I mean, in a park not far from here, right? Right. So I think that having these conversations is absolutely essential. I think having these conversations without guilt or defaulting to self-flagellation is very helpful. Some people think in having these conversations that what is desired is for white people to feel guilty. Wrong. That goes nowhere. That produces no life. That's its own brand of narcissism. What is more helpful is the acknowledgement, right? And then figuring out ways that move forward, that free us. And this is Dr. King's real genius. That free certain people to get certain people out from under that guilt, shame, and obligation, and other people out of this conversation of constant victimhood. Where both of us, both sides of the group, move in to a new depth of humanity, right? And the community experiences well-being. Now, I know what you're saying. That sounds lovely. Thank you for your contribution. But I think the way forward, really, is for individuals, you and I, to challenge the narratives we presently hold and increase our own personal capacity to have those conversations. I think that's the only way forward. You know, we can't look to Washington in this iteration, and we couldn't look to Washington in the previous iteration. Let's be fair. Right? So the answer is actually not, the Calvary is actually not on the way. Right? God's Calvary is sitting right here. Right? And, in the spirit of good Cleveland Browns football and good Pittsburgh Steelers football, it is 1 yard at a time, block and tackle. 1 yard at a time, block and tackle. And so I'm encouraged by these kinds of conversations. But, I'll ask us all to look at our preset around defensiveness. I made a comment in the sermon today about, I think, spiritual growth. One of the results of spiritual growth should be that you and I find the bandwidth in these really kind of potentially volatile conversations to forsake defensiveness and adopt curiosity. By the way, that works at home. You suck. Just my household. Tell me more, honey. I'm working on that one. Y'all pray for me. No, but I mean, a little levity, but I hope you get the point. The point is nevertheless, and it's not my point, it's a paradigm I bring forward. That is the work. I find that so many of us sort of clutch our pearls when a black person says X or a white person says X. Well, grow up. There are multiple interpretations of reality. And if I don't live as you live, I won't understand with any great depth your perception. But what is true is that there are multiple interpretations of reality. I challenged myself because I saw I have about 300 clergy in my diocese. I saw, that we had a traffic shooting as well in Atlanta. It seems no one is immune. And I challenged myself. Every once in a while I remember all the stuff I say and I try to do it. And so I remember that I chose the mayor, a school friend of mine, former mayor is a school friend of mine, so I called him up and said, hey, I want you to put me in a police car in the worst neighborhood with some white cops. I spent a 4-hour shift with those guys. And there are no excuses for the abuse of that authority. None. I'm convinced. However, I after that 4-hour shift, I think I began to understand the cumulative effect of that work on the most decent person. And I must say to you, like the sermon I said, it turned me. And so I think the space that you and I should be aspiring to occupy is that space in between. The Bible says, who will stand in the gap? Well, that's you and I. We stand in the gap. We remind people of the common humanity. And so young white cop came down from Buffalo, New York to Atlanta, Georgia because he wanted to serve. He wanted to serve. He wanted to serve in one of our open air heroin markets. Go figure. And he was there trying to render service as best as he could and all of that. And there's no tragic story, so you don't have to brace yourself. But I just saw 4 hours of his life. And I realized this tiger that we have by the tail, called race, is very, very complicated. So I'll challenge you the way that Brian Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy, challenged my diocese. And so, before you and I sort of pop off from our easy chair in front of the big screen television, I think what is demanded from each of us, in fact, I know what is demanded from each of us, is proximity. Do not sit in your gated community, an enclave, and pass judgment. I say that to you as someone who, I got that whisper from the Spirit to my own heart, right? That contributes nothing positive to the conversation. It's proximity. Proximity is the only thing that can break that unfortunate sort of dance routine. Proximity. Right? Because then we've got some skin in the game, then we're alongside people, then we get a slice of reality on the other side. Then I think we have something to say. And you have to stay longer than just to check your liberal credential box. Can we speak frankly? I'm talking about black and white alike. I graduated at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And I went to serve in one of the tragic neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, cycles of poverty, all the indicators, which is sort of a stone's throw from the White House. And I remember, in D.C., light skin, dark skin means something. And I remember being there, and I remember the dark skinned residents there saying, well, once you get your sort of upper middle class black card checked, I guess you'll be on. So it's not just a white thing I'm saying to people. I think what I'm saying is that if we're going to be involved, if we're going to present ourselves as a living sacrifice, we care this much about this issue, it's going to take proximity and persistence. And I think that's the only way anything changes. The last thing I'll say, and then I hope you'll have a question, we can talk some more, is, how about we just have some questions? That's plenty. That's plenty. Yes, sir.
I grew up
Yes, sir.
And discussed to be called boy all the time. I don't know what to be called boy. And the N-word, I'm confused all my life about that person. I know these guys call me boy, but let me do that. My teacher called me boy. Sometimes my white friends call me N-word, because they say the N-word with the fingers on the nose.
Good Lord.
Really hurt me, but I just let it blow. But what's the difference between a boy or the N-word? Could you explain that?
No, sir. I think that I think that both of those words are a dignity violation, right? And I think that both of those words point to our American family history. I think that that's one of the things we've got to do. We've got to develop our bandwidth to acknowledge our story. I think the data is clear. I mean, what's that old thing about you're entitled to your opinion, but not a separate set of facts.
Amen.
I hope it's not news to anybody here, but the data's in. It's really clear by some of our brightest minds, black and white alike. And that is the American slave trade drove a America's industrial revolution. I mean, all the receipts from that. I mean, it just is. Our country began a great, chapter of its greatness on the backs of stolen personhood and stolen labor. And whether we struggle or not to embrace that, it is nevertheless true. And whether we want to feel better about ourselves because we say, well, but I've worked for mine, okay, no argument for me. But the truth of the matter is that the tailwind that many white folks enjoyed was because of stolen personhood and 400 years of stolen labor. And think about that. There's some business people in the room. Think about that. If you had to account for that on your books, what number would you give that? Good Lord. And what's terrible, and I'll speak up for the South since I'm here, is what's kind of terrible about that, and Ohio, you may be exempt to an extent, but the South sort of lives with a lot of the residue or the shadow of all of that. But a lot of those dollars, arguably a very many of those dollars came north in undergirded industry and business advancement. So, what I'm trying to say is that is our American story. And so what we've got to try to do is figure out ways to surface that, have that conversation, and begin to process that. Realize that some of that stuff, again, anybody here part of the family? Anybody here have Thanksgiving? It really is the same, right? So aren't there stories that you don't want to tell or have tell when the family gets together? Because it's going to elicit a particular kind of, well, it might mess up things before the coffee and the dessert get there, right? So that's what it is. And so I think that what we need is more people being able to occupy those stories with all these tragic chapters with grace. We are starting to see Hollywood embrace this and begin to help tell this story in ways that we can process it. See, here's the problem that you and I are experiencing. We tried to keep this thing locked in a box for a couple of 100 years. And it just won't stay in the box. And so some people would say, well, aren't we done talking about this? Shouldn't we just move on? Well, here's the problem. We never did talk about it. On that mystical, magical day when the Emancipation Proclamation was read, we were free from chattel slavery for about 5 minutes. But then, enslaved by poverty and illiteracy. Thank you very much. Right? And then, of course, we morphed. We developed a new business system, which became Jim Crow, and you know the story. So we actually haven't had a fulsome conversation about it ever, because it's too raw. It's that conversation at the dinner table. And so my great hope is that people who have Jesus Christ as the center of their community, of their life, of their own core spirituality, can begin intentionally to investigate where they are on those matters, to do some reading, to do some shared conversation, to take proximity up with groups that they strain to understand or perhaps struggle to love, and for us to be a work in progress. Again, this is why I think Lent is so crucial. Because Lent invites us into a season of focus, where we can begin to focus. So it's not just our own thing, but, where in my community do I see gaps? I end up, because of my role, I end up being the only dude in lots of rooms. It's tragic. It's tragic. And then I think about it, again, I love the business people, right? Because you guys get it. So what's the downside of that? Well, diversity, whatever the hell that means. Here's what you're missing out on. You're missing out on someone who could bring resources, resilience, new kinds of problem solving to the equation. Business is starting to figure this out, not for the same moral reasons as you and I might be having this conversation, but business is starting to figure this out. Because business needs, increasingly new ways to solve problems given the velocity and complexity of life. And so they are deciding now to look to non-traditional communities for help in problem solving, right? They have that bottom line imperative. Our imperative is very different. Our imperative is, you are my brother. You are my sister. Any way you cut it, I'm yours, you're mine. So I think this has to be at the core of who we are. So we have to develop our personal capacity. We investigate who we are, what we think, what we've been taught. We lay claim to it, right? And then we offer it up to the Lord. I think that's where we have to get to. You know, what's funny about all of this is God already knows our hearts. Right? So I think, you know, you and I need to realize and be assured that there's no condemnation in Christ. We are what we are. We have the narrative we have. And that can be offered. That can be offered. So, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
So,
I'll try to make the answer shorter.
keep going as you're going. So, you know, I heard a great analogy one time, which is this tailwind that you talked about can be really tangibly represented in a game that we all know, which is Monopoly. Right? And what is it if you enter a game of Monopoly 4 hours late? You got nothing. You hope you go to jail so that you don't have to pay anybody else for all the hotels they've managed to build.
Yes.
So, and this game of Monopoly is also in some ways, you know, it's so fun for all of us. We sort of think about it as a kind of American dream game, right? So my question really is, how do you think the American dream is going to change?
How will it change?
How must it change?
Well, it has changed. It has changed a lot. You know, my mind runs a lot of places to that story, in that question. I think the first thing my mind runs to is, you know, I think a very palpable force is in the room in a lot of places. We see this in gerrymandering and other things in our political spheres. And it's this great fear of white dispossession. And I think that some of us, at one level or the other, have struggling acknowledging that and sort of, you know, talking about that. But I think it's nevertheless real. Let me give you an example. In the state of Georgia, where I'm known to be, I was telling friends last night, 2 years ago, we just moved into a chapter where there are more black and brown live births than white live births. And so I think, you know, let's just take racism off the table for just a second here, right? So I think that discerning people can do math. And they can say more of these and less of these, right? And then also look at the fertility rates here. More of these and less of these, given the democratic construct, is going to yield that people who were formerly in the majority are going to be now in the racial minority. Which is to say they're going to control resources. Which is to say they're going to make policy. Right? Which is to say they now perhaps are going to be embarking on a chapter that they watched at a distance. So I think that is a very real thing in terms of monopoly. And I think that our political sort of gerrymandering and et cetera are trying to compensate for that. I mean, also, again, I'm sure Ohio is altogether wonderful. But in the state of Georgia, you know, we look at we look at all this sort of voter things, poll hours not being published, things being, look, the Secretary of State in the state of Georgia is a member of the Episcopal Church. And I said some stuff in the sermon, as you might gather, I'm wont to do. And he came to my office to talk to me. He said, well, why is it that you're saying that there's voter fraud? And why, I mean, not voter fraud, but why are you saying that the polls are being blocked for people and we're doing sort of paying where's the nut under the shell with voter registration? And he gave me quite a thorough chewing out, but with a smile. And in the South, at the end of that, we say, bless your heart. So it was all over. Only to find that the news story broke about 2 months later, and then he was the first one to write me a note about that, acknowledging that is actually happening. So there is a brand monopoly game. And I think that, you know, what's tragic about that is it's just sort of tribes competing against each other. I think this is why, you know, this notion of American citizenry is so crucial. Not an exclusionary vision of American citizenry, but I think that you and I understanding that we're going to have to take up our stake in that. And we're going to have to sort of try to figure out ways in which we can all flourish. I just don't see that enough. I see people playing to things called the base. Again, I was heard a wonderful point last night from your own bishop. We're saying, you know, we used to talk about constituents. Now we're talking about our base. I think that is an indicator of this monopoly game. You know, I know the brother from Tesla is trying to get us all to Mars. You know, I think that it's going to take some heavy lifting. And you know what also encourages me is this. If we learn anything from civil rights, Martin Luther King aside, we learn anything from civil rights, it was men and women who put their skin in the game who changed it. Names that I would call, perhaps you wouldn't even know. A woman by the name of Ella Baker. who was the person who was able to love and mobilize black and white bodies to do the Freedom Rides, the counter-sits, etc., which are yielding the fellowship that you and I right now are enjoying. I mean, I still do believe, and don't think me too naive, I still do believe men and women using their spheres of influence to make sometimes glacial progress is the best we got. You know, let me just say this too. You know, I'm looking for the white subversives. You know, y'all see me coming. You know, I was telling some friends last night, you know, there's the big mouth biracial dude. Can't wait for him to get back on the airplane, right? but you know, I do believe it's the stakeholders in the status quo who, as the psalmist says, learn a new song, who will contribute mightily to the next chapter. That's always been the model. This present stakeholders whose hearts get turned changes everything. Yes, ma'am?
I have a hand of God story. I feel so fortunate, and I'm going to tell you why. I graduated from college with the most expensive education money could buy, but the only job I could get, this was in the early 70s, was a secretary, but it was at Harvard Law School. And I worked for the Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review, so we had an office with a lot of diversity, and I feel so fortunate to have made friends with African Americans. And I went to lunch with a young man who had become my friend from work, and we were in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they don't exist anymore, in this wonderful kind of divey restaurant. And a young white, probably student woman, young woman came in and came over to take our order. And so we gave, what I thought was we gave her her order, and he says to me, "Did you see what just happened?" I said, "No." And he said, "She only talked to you." And that was so astounding to me. I thought, well, first of all, this is a man who's gotten into Harvard Law School. I couldn't get into Harvard Law School. And he'd had this experience that I thought was astounding. And that's why I say it was the hand of God. I would have never known the kind of experience. And he was so ashamed. You know, it wasn't really a date that he felt like he had to pay or anything like that. We were just friends. But she wouldn't even look him in the eye. So I just feel so fortunate that I get it.
Happens all the time. Happens to me all the time.
That's
I'm
horrible.
telling you. Happens to me all the time. I'll be standing with a white colleague who I often outrank by a bit.
Yeah.
And people will go directly and address the white gentleman or white lady, so on and so forth, and I will be, you know, sort of off to the side. It happens all the time. And so I think you're really fortunate in that you can acknowledge. And some people say, well, you know, what are you saying? You know, that's a microaggression. Well, it's experienced as a microaggression, but what it is it's exhibit A of the bias we walk around with. The unexamined bias. Again, let me make my pitch for Lent. The unexamined bias. Right? So I think that, you know, I want to be gracious to people. So I've sort of learned to sort of not zap that guy or that girl. Right? But if I get a chance to be in a conversation with them, begin to sort of, you know, increase over, you know, lots of practice to sort of guide that person into reflecting on that moment. I mean, you and I are products of our culture. It's in the air in our American family. Right? So you are a great ambassador, evangelist now, having had that experience.
Well, he gave me wonderful advice. I was just astounded, and I said, what can I do?
Yeah.
And he said, when you come across, when you're in passing, when you pass by an African American, try to catch his or her eye and smile. And I have done that from that day forward, and it's amazing what a difference when you smile or speak to an African American and his or her face lights up. We're suddenly in communion with each other.
Together.
Yeah.
I walk into my own cathedral, my cathedral, and people look away. Now, when I have the collar on, they salute the roll. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating that exists. And so I think for those of us on the receiving side of that slight, I think, what you and I can do is that sort of, we can allow that to drive us into a place of despair and discouragement. Or we can somehow find the capacity to begin to sort of use that as bridge building. But it is that simple and that complex. Yes, ma'am.
You brought up that we first got started in slavery.
Yes, ma'am.
But I look at our government, that they've been very smart, and every time we make a stride, they find another way. I mean, at the end of World War II, they decided we would have a white middle class, so they built those little tract homes, they started for college funds, but they also increased the prisons, because they figured that's where we were going to go. And it has continued through the 60s, through the 70s. I mean, it didn't matter who's in the White House. I mean, the Panthers were trying to feed people in Oakland, but they felt that they were a threat to the American way of life. And then, the whole drug thing, I always say, we don't own any planes or boats bringing the drugs into this country. I mean, at one time, the first Bush was in league with the president of Panama. And he had a thing going where the drugs and the guns were coming. But then, he stepped on Bush's feet and he got arrested. I mean, we went to a country and arrested that president and brought him here. And it's like it just keeps going. And I keep hoping when my kids are growing up, it would be different. Now I'm hoping for my grandchildren, it will be different. I mean, when my family came to this country, I'm one of those Jamaican Americans, they came with this was going to be something better. Now, I grew up with all my cousins, those were my friends, but I have learned, and I know my dad, the older people in my family just kept telling us what we needed to watch out for. I've been fortunate, I've never been slighted, but I have this kind of personality, and it must come out of my pores. I don't get slighted, but I have seen it, and I just think it has to stop.
Yeah.
But when, I don't know, because here we are, 2018.
Right, and I had to have the same conversation with my son, who's 6'3" and handsome, and he's a powder puff. But I had to have a conversation with him about how he may be perceived when he gets in his car.
Oh, I had that with my son, who had dreads down to
Yeah.
his waist. And one night I was in his truck in California, and when I made myself known to the policeman, that is what saved my son's life. He had been in California for 6 months and stopped 40 times and never helped him.
So,
He's a different person now.
Yeah.
He's learned how to, he got rid of the dreads, but because of his career, what he does, he's another person. He doesn't get slighted. It must be my personality in him.
bless the Lord. So I think three things I want to say there. I think what we have to be careful with here is, and I'm interested in really in the spiritual side of this, because I think out of inspiration comes, so I think you've got to take a look at, for some of us who may sit at this with some indifference, you've got to examine your indifference. That's a spiritual condition. I think number two, you can't give in to contempt. That's a spiritual condition, right? And then I think number three, you've got to give up passivity and take up agency. So I think that's the sort of holy trinity of how we begin to engage. There's too much to say there, but has anybody read Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book? I'm old school. I like James Baldwin, right? James Baldwin can get you there faster. I thought, don't let this be recorded. I thought that Ta-Nehisi Coates' sort of first work, having spent a lot of time with James Baldwin, was like elevator music, right? I thought it wasn't. That's not nice. I thought so, but I have to say to you, this second book, it has, I think, very significant and substantial explanations of the systematizing of some of these personal things that we're talking about. And it's the best thing that I have read recently about laying that bare. Of course, Michelle Alexander and other people, but I think that if you really want to sort of go down to the boiler room on, America's systematizing bias, prejudice, etc., and leveraging that for economic gain, I think you have to read his essays. There are 8 essays. And I think that, why I commend them is because it's not sort of love Obama in 8 chapters. He calls, as a black man, calls an African-American president on the carpet about his collusion with that system, and talks about how pervasive it is. So if you want to sort of take a deep dive and look at how housing markets emerged, the way they've emerged, how the greatest sort of welfare was to the World War II veterans, white welfare World War II veterans when they came home. They got track homes and free education, etc., and we were systematically redlined and excluded. So there's a great systematizing of all of this, and I think it's important to take a look at it. I know she's walking, which means we've got a couple minutes. So the young lady, I see a young gentleman, and then sir in the back. Yes, ma'am. You got to give it to me in your outside voice. Yes, she said, why do you think it's important to talk to intergenerational, just paraphrasing, intergenerational groups, all kinds of people? Well, because I think that, it is true, and all the data points to the fact that we live in bubbles, right? If I'm not careful and intentional, I'll only talk to, very educated, certain small segment of the population. I think we saw some of that in 2016. We realized how sort of bubbled we are, whatever your particular bubble is. And so I think that, just like the news right now, I think that we only end up getting amens to already half-witted conclusions. So I think that the best spirit of dialogue and engagement is where I'm actually confronted with a different viewpoint in a respectful fashion. I live, like I said, I have 5 kids, and a couple of them still live at my house. And, on the times I can set my father hat down and ask them what it's like to be them out in the world, in school, private schools, doing whatever, I'm amazed at some of the things I learned. I realize my age. I'm still talking about Bull Connor, and Dr. King, and they're like, who? Not literally, but kinda. And so the thing that we're sort of talking about is morphing at present. The taproot is the same, but the blossoms are different. And so it's important, if you and I are going to have a great understanding, to talk to lots of different kinds of people. Plus, we're going soon. And what we want for you is to be equipped with that knowledge and understanding so you can take it the next chapter. Thurgood Marshall sat in an Episcopal church as a boy, and look what he yielded for us. So it's important. He was equipped by people like Charles Hamilton Houston and others, seniors, elders. He was engaged and equipped, and then he yielded a better America for us. Yes, sir.
So I've had the pleasure of being out of the country the last few years and kind of being on the outside looking in. And I guess one of the things I've been looking more towards is the problem solving that comes to this. Things like I think making communities more diverse is one of the best steps to getting somewhere. And to do that, I feel like giving more opportunities in things like housing and education is one of the best steps to do that. And I'm just kind of curious on your thoughts on how to solve these problems.
Yeah, well, boy, I tell you, if I had that, I'd be on a real big book tour right now. But I think, and not to sort of continue to go over it, I still think it's really an individual agency. I think you cannot Facebook-like your way into a new reality. I think that, your generation, frankly, and us continually are going to have to figure out, how to focus. And if we really, really care about this, then that means we're going to focus, right? And if we're going to focus, that means we're going to take up agency and action. We're going to do outrageous things like Bob Moses did in civil rights, who had an Ivy League brain, but took it to the Delta of Mississippi to teach those kids math. This is why our faith is so important, because it wants to thrust us into a new way of being, right? And so the principle in the incarnation, that is Jesus coming among us, is the very best heaven-negated community coming down to nowhere Nazareth. I think that's still the paradigm, right? So individually, are we prepared to do that? I can tell you that that's very difficult. All the priests, not all, but most of the young seminarians and young priests in my diocese want to serve the Lord in metropolitan Atlanta for $100,000. That's not a slight, but that's the tension. You see, that's the tension. And yet we are inheritors of people, we venerate people who did just the opposite. You know, Dr. King's preaching in Washington National Cathedral. On one day, he's with sanitation workers. The next day, a Nobel Peace Prize recipient. So I think that's the paradigm, is that where will you apply your heart and intentions? You know, I think that's the first step. Yes, sir. Last one. I think we got to go to church here in a minute.
I believe his name is Albert Hill. His question is, these lessons have been taught through church and family for decades.
Yes, sir.
How do we increase absorption?
Yeah, that's the great question. See, of course, in the world, there are two kinds of problems. Technical, which is we need a new paint color. We know we already have the knowledge, so we can figure out how to do that. You know, business will help us do that. Consultants have that knowledge. The problem is clear, and so is the answer. That's a technical problem. What race is our adaptive problem. That's why I always refer people back to marriages. No easy fix. Isn't that true? No, not your marriage, right? Just my marriage? That's cool. That's cool. So we're talking about an adaptive problem. We're talking about the shift of norms, worldviews, and values. And what we know is that that's not microwave popcorn. So I think that even though church gets a bad rap, I think it's the one intergenerational place that we have, an opportunity we have to try to really to try to get this absorption. But we have to also be able to admit, and that's why I think the church still is a great opportunity, we have to admit, I think it goes to confession, the ways in which we frustrate grace. The ways in which we are sold out to the status quo. And as long as those sad stories don't end up on my address, then they're not deserving of my full attention. I'm talking black and white alike. So I think that's where it is. There's an adaptive challenge that this nation has. It's had a tragic past. It doesn't have to be a tragic future. But people are going to have to care enough on in a sustained fashion to begin to move that needle. I think we're seeing some expressions of hopefulness around the place. Again, I'm very encouraged by the business community in a lot of places. But I think the church has got to continue to beat this drum. And again, it doesn't have to just be the drum of race specifically. It is the drum of the irreducibility of neighbor. You know, because someone doesn't have a penis doesn't mean that they deserve less wages. I mean, and so on down the sad story. So I think that's where it is. The absorption is, it can't just be what we do for February or March for Women's Month. It has to be a sustained raising of the floor height about how we understand neighbor. And for that, I think there's no better helpmate than Jesus. Because he just will not relent. That's why we killed him.
Thank you for turning the table.
Thank you.